I think because of the way that they performed in the last 3 games of this series, which ultimately sent them home, I think you keep them together. I don't think they necessarily need anything new in order to win a chip. You keep Doc Rivers, you keep that coaching staff, you keep every single one of those players, even though Montrezl Harrell is approaching free agency, and he's got some explaining to do as to why he only averaged 2.6 rebounds per game in this series when Jokic averaged 13 rebounds along with his 24 points on 51% shooting and nearly 40% from three-point range. I think that, obviously Harrell has something to prove. The biggest reason that I think that you keep them together is a couple of things. I think that Kawhi, being the superstar that he is, still a top 5 player in the game. I think he has a lot to make up for, considering the fact that this was his first, venture into being that face of a franchise, that number one option with the expectations draped on his shoulders to come into the Clippers organization. Well, there's but so many games I'm going to play. There's but so many practices that I'm going to attend. I'm going to be in shape, make no mistake about it, but I'm going to show up with the practice when I want to show up. I'm going to miss practices when I feel I need to miss practices, etc., etc. As a leader of a franchise, you set a very, very bad tone. If you're Lou Williams, boy, do you have a lot of making up to do. The best part of you in this series was your post-game press conference in the aftermath of losing Game 7, because he was very eloquent and candid in his assessment of what transpired, but he only averaged 10 points this series, and he was horrific from three-point range, shooting like 14%. That's not Lou Williams. This is a 2-time sixth man of the year. This brother is a star scoring the basketball. He is a professional scorer. There was no excuse for him to be as anemic as he was, other than the fact that clearly you didn't really, really want to be there. That's why they got a new nickname for you, Lemon Pepper Lou. You will understand why that transpired. You've got some making up to do. And then, of course, there's Paul George. We can't ignore the situation involving Paul George. I'm here to tell you, Max, one of the nicest dudes you'll ever want to meet in your life. Impossible to root against. He is a star in this league, but nevertheless, boy, did he not show up. It was Brick City. It was a straight choke job on his part as well. And what the biggest thing about Paul George that he needs to pay attention to, Paul George is in danger. Are you ready for this, Max? He's in danger of becoming the second coming of Dwight Howard. Remember, Dwight Howard was the man in Orlando, just like Paul George was the man in Indiana. He wanted to leave. He goes to L.A., he ends up going to Houston, and then before long, he's a journeyman, Washington, Charlotte, etc., because the star that he once was, he was no more. And so because of that, everybody says they harken back to that. He should have never left Orlando. That was an ideal situation for him. They built the franchise around him. Even though he didn't win the chip, they got to the finals in 2009. And now Dwight Howard is a role player. Even though I think he's doing an exceptional job in L.A. in a reserve role, and I think he's going to play a big role in this series along with JaVale McGee and Anthony Davis, triple teaming, basically throwing a three-headed monster at Jokic on the defensive side of the floor. But in the end, what it comes down to is that if you're Paul George, okay, you were in Indiana, then you were in OKC. Now you're in L.A. with the Clippers. And Max just said in order for this team to get the parts that it needs, even though I don't agree with you, you're talking about how you'd have to move Paul George in order to do that. So I think all of those things elevates the level of incentive. I think you keep the Clippers as is, stand pat. They were embarrassed. They're highly motivated. You anticipate that a pandemic won't stall next season, that you'll move full steam ahead. And I think you keep them together for one last run. Remember, both Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, 2-1. 2 years with a third-year option for each player. They could have signed for a 4-year deal or whatever. Neither of them did it. They can opt out after this upcoming season. This season could be on the line. If you're Ballmer, I think you give everybody one more shot, letting them know I will clean house in a heartbeat, and y'all will be gone from Tinseltown if y'all don't get it done next season. I keep them together.
Couple things. Paul George and Dwight Howard, to me, are very different. I understand you mean bouncing from team to team, but Paul George is a guy without
that's all I was talking about.
His game. He's
that's
such
all I
a
meant.
Well-rounded. He's such a well-rounded player. He's balled wherever he's been. The issue is he's miscast as a centerpiece. He's really what Paul George is best, as we see in the playoffs, is a top-notch kind of complementary player, but maybe not the second most important player on the team even when it matters most, whereas Dwight Howard was much more one-dimensional. And as the league changed, it really didn't favor the way he played. I understand what you mean, though, bouncing around, but I think Paul George's intrinsic, not only ability, but well-rounded game will keep him as a very valuable player for a while, right? Whether or not he's really a guy you can rely on under pressure. In terms of the Clippers' motivation, yes, they will be highly motivated. But what you noticed about their offense was they didn't really have a creator. Who creates the offense? Really, it's Kawhi Leonard. When he draws, he's become a much better passer, and that's the guy who really you run the offense through. But is Kawhi best used that way, in fact? Or should you get a more traditional ball handler like Jrue Holiday, who can play off the ball also, obviously, who can shoot, who can defend, who steps up big time under pressure? And in order to get a guy like that, I agree, you're best off keeping Kawhi and Paul George. But then the question becomes that entire supporting cast. Like if I asked you, Stephen A., if you had to move Montrezl Harrell and Patrick Beverley, would you do it as I mentioned Lou Williams, for Jrue Holiday? I would. What if you had to also get rid of Lou Williams? Like, in other words, what if you had to give everything you had except your centerpiece players for a guy like that? And then you try to fill in the blanks like the Lakers just did. The Clippers may be better off doing that. And by the way, no knock against Montrezl Harrell, who played poorly, but was completely outmatched by Jokic. Like, he's not in Jokic's class. There's nothing he can do with Jokic. It doesn't mean he's not a good player. He's a solid player. He's just not a star.
Well, thank you for that soliloquy. My retort would be this. 13 rebounds to 2 is a problem when you're looking for a new contract if you're Montrezl Harrell. That's number one. That's more important. That's most importantly to point out. And number two, what it really comes down to, again, is I am not saying that you couldn't do things to buffer your chances as a championship. What I'm saying is it's a long shot that you're going to be able to pull all of those things off. Do they have enough right now to win a title next year? Yes, they do. If they act like a team and come together and stop being prima donnas. Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.